Hello and welcome to PSD Tuts Plus. My name is Martin Perhiniak. In this tutorial I'm going to talk about how to work with gradients in Photoshop. Gradients can be used for a lot of things. You can use them as effects. In graphic design, gradients are used on buttons, backgrounds, all types of elements. But apart from that, you can also use them to create effects on your photos. If you combine them with blend modes, you can also use them for selections if you use quick mask, and you can also use them for layer masks. You can use the gradient editor to specify all the attributes of your gradients, and you can manage your gradients in the presets manager. All this I'm going to cover in this tutorial, so if you ever wanted to learn everything you need to know about gradients in Photoshop, then please join me this time. So first of all, let me show you how I create a gradient fill on a separate layer and use it as an effect on this photo. I'm going to create a new layer and I'm going to use the gradient tool, and the keyboard shortcut is G. And you can just select it from the toolbar, and as you can see I have a red color as my foreground color, and here on the top in the options bar I have the second option selected from the swatches on the gradients, which means foreground color to transparent. That's the one I'm going to use at this moment, and I'm going to use the first one, the linear gradient option, which is the standard one, and I have normal, opacity 100%, no reverse, dither turned on, and transparency turned on as well. Then I'm going to click and drag. The first point is the start point of my gradient, and last point is the end point of it, and I can hold down shift to keep this completely straight and vertical. So I'm going to create my gradient like this. Now, as you can see, this gradient is on a separate layer, so I can always turn it on and off. And if I turn off the background layer, then we can see how the gradient looks like. So it's not a transition between two colors, it's a transition between red color and transparency. So it's basically creating a fade out effect from the intense red color. So if I turn back my background layer and I change the blend mode of this layer, probably let's just try overlay, then we can see a really nice mixing of this layer on the top and the layer below it. So we created a nice warm effect on the sky. Let me show it before and after. It made the whole photo much more interesting. Of course, we can do a lot of more things with gradients. Let me just show you. If we create a frame, for example, I'm going to use the shape tools, and I'm going to use the rounded rectangle tool. Just going to create it here, and I'm going to set up no stroke, and I will use a fill color, maybe a yellow fill color. Then I can double click on this rounded rectangle, and we can go to the gradient overlay option, which is when it's selected, we have all the options here on the right. And as you can see, I can already set a blend mode for this effect, the gradient overlay, and I just set it to overlay. As you can see already, that added that nice transition effect or gradient effect on that original orange color on this rectangle. So you can use these simple ways to incorporate gradient effects on your designs or your photos, but let's just dive deeper into the gradient options. So the option that we used first of all was a gradient fill on a blank new layer. But we can actually create a separate fill layer if we go to the layer menu and choose new fill layer, and there we have the option called gradient. So once we select that, we can even name this. It will create a new layer, but this is a special layer. It's a gradient fill layer. Here we can set up which gradient do we want to use. Let me just use the standard black to white. You can set up whether we want the style to be linear or any other. I can even select any of these here. Let's just use maybe diamond, just to have an interesting style on this gradient. And then we can change the angle, and we can even change the scale of this. And the advantage of using a gradient fill layer is that we can always come back to these options later. So if I click on OK, let me just turn off this layer on the top for now. So I accepted the changes on this gradient fill layer, and if I double click on it again, I will still have these options available. And by the way, if you want to use this with a blend mode, of course you can do that as well. We can go to the blend mode options, and maybe we can use something like screen, or we can use multiply, and we can use these type of effects for a lot of different things. So just to make sure you understand, the previous effect that I created on a new layer, it's not as easy as this gradient fill layer to make changes on. So for example, I can move it around, but to be able to change its color, I would need to use an adjustment, for example, hue saturation. While this one, the gradient fill layer, has a lot of controls that I can access. I can change the color of my gradient as well, and I can do so much more here, and it's completely non-destructive. So I can always come back to these options and make my changes here. To be able to understand all the controls for your gradient, you can always select the gradient tool, and then you can see these options here on the top. If you want to access the gradient editor, you can click on this icon here, which shows the actual selected gradient at the moment. So if you click on this, you can enter the gradient editor. And this is where you can learn a lot more about gradients. First of all, you can see your presets, all the gradients that you have set up in your Photoshop. You can always make changes to these in the presets manager, which I'm going to show you soon. But first of all, let's just concentrate on the options for gradients. First of all, you can change solid to noise. And noise is a very interesting option. It's rarely used, but it can be used for some graphic design reasons. So you can set the roughness of the noise on your gradient or reduce it. So it's basically starting with a color that you use for your gradient, and then it starts adding random colors into it. It's quite interesting option, and you can always click on randomize to create new options or new noise gradients. But the most usual one to work with is the solid gradient. So once you have a solid gradient, you can here specify color stops at the bottom and opacity stops on the top. And once you have more stops, let's just say I add another color here. I'm going to select blue. Then between these two stops, we will have these midpoints, and we can also move those around. Now, if I select this opacity stop on the top and I set it to 100%, then we will see that we have a gradient with 3 color stops and 2 midpoints. We can now see easily what does a midpoint means. It actually increases one of the color stops and has more length for that stop to show, while the other one will have less. You can always balance out how much you want of one color, and while the transition appears between the 2 color stops. So you can change that location even here at the bottom. So you can be very precise with the percentage. You can set it back to 50% if you want to have it exactly in the middle. And you can also move color stops around. Whenever a color stop is selected, you have again a location percentage option, and you also have the color option, on which if you click on it, you can make changes to it. To create new color stops, you just simply need to click on a blank area below the gradient. That will create a new color stop. Let me just change again this to a different color. Now you can see it's there. If you want to make changes to an opacity stop, you just need to select it. Then you can specify the opacity and also the location. And the same way as you create a new color stop, you can also create a new opacity stop by clicking anywhere on a blank area above the gradient, like this. So quite simple. And you can also change the smoothness of your gradient, which will use less color variation between the color stops, or if you set it up to 100%, it will use much more smoother and much more colors for the transition. So you can see before and after, it becomes much more smoother if I set it up to 100%. And once you're happy with the new gradient, you can always give it a name. I'm going to just give it test, and then I can click on new, and that will be added to my presets manager. So it will be here, but if I click on OK and I go to edit presets, preset manager, here I can choose gradients, and there at the bottom I will see that gradient that we just saved, which I can even see its name. If I hover over it long enough, it tells me that it's the test, the gradient called test. If I decide to delete a gradient, I can always click on delete. But let me just show you, if I want to use this, I can use it in many ways. I can select it from the gradient selector here on the top, and then I can apply it quite easily. So I'm going to replace that gradient there that I used. Obviously, this is a little bit more surrealistic effect than what we had before, but we can also use it as a layer style. I'm going to select that rectangle that we created earlier. I double click on it, and from the gradient overlay here, I can select it the same way as we selected for a fill. So now it's available there. And when you use a gradient as a layer style, you have several options here. You can still change the style of it from linear to radial, angle, reflected, or diamond. All of these options, you have them available here. You can change its angle, which is quite useful. You can change its scale, and you can reverse it and even reduce its opacity or set a blend mode on it. And last but not least, I would like to show you how to use gradients for selections and masking, because that's another very useful thing to use in Photoshop. So let's just say I would like to make a selection which is a gradual selection, so it is based on a gradient basically. I can press Q to enter quick mask mode for that, and then I use my gradient tool and I set it back to the default black and white, and then I am going to create a gradient here. In quick mask mode, you will always have an overlay which represents your selection, and here you can see we have a gradient selection because it's effective on the top and then it fades out. So wherever it's black, it will be represented by this red overlay, and then it fades out. We can see how this works as a selection if I press Q, because now we can see that everything is selected at the bottom, which was white in my gradient, and it gradually fades out to black here on the top. If I make something on a selection, or maybe fill this in with a color on a new layer, this selection, then we can see how it worked. So the bottom part is now filled in with red, and the top part is transparent. So let me just do this once again. I'm going to enter the quick mask mode, create a gradient from left to right, like that, press Q again, and then you can see how it's turned into a selection. I create a new layer and fill that in with, let's just say blue. Just change the color. You can see how it worked on a selection. So that is one way to work with gradients in your selections, but let me show you another way. Masking with a gradient is also an option. If we have a layer and we click on create a mask for that layer, then we can use the gradient tool, and click and drag will create a gradient on the mask. This is again a very useful option to mix images together gradually. So instead of having a very crisp edge between two images when you use a mask, you can use the gradient tool and apply a gradient on your mask like this. And I just wanted to mention that you can find a lot of gradient presets on the internet if you look around, and you can download them for free. And once you have the file, the gradients file, you can always double click on it, and then it will import all those gradient presets into Photoshop. But you can also find quite a lot of default options here in Photoshop. If you go to the options on the gradient tool, you can find these presets here at the bottom. So you will have metals, you have pastels, you have special effects, and so on and so forth. So that's all what you need to know about gradients, and I hope you found this tutorial useful. And if you want to learn more about colors in Photoshop, make sure you join me next time as well. Thanks a lot for your attention.